For today's event, we are very happy to host a lecture today entitled BDS for Palestinian Rights, the Legacy of Mandela and Dr. King, and it of course is a particular honor to host this event during Black History Month and remember some of the inspirations that the civil rights movement brings to the movement for Palestinian rights. Our speaker today is Omar Barghouti. He's an independent Palestinian researcher, commentator, and human rights activist committed to upholding international law and universal human rights. He is a founding member of the Palestinian Campaign for Academic and Cultural Boycott of Israel, also known by its acronym PACB, and the Palestinian Civil Society Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions, or BDS, campaign against Israel. For those of you who are tuning in online, we hope to be able to engage you in our conversation during the question and answer session, and you can contribute your questions or comments via Facebook or the chat roll on our live stream page, or by sending us messages through Twitter by sending them to @Palestine Center. And so I'd like to welcome at this point Mr. Omar Barghouti, and let me just say that at the end of the discussion we also have his latest book on BDS, a very important contribution that is available for sale, and he will be available to sign some of those as well. So without further ado, Omar Barghouti. Thank you. Just turn down the lights now, and I'll come back up for the question and answer.
Okay. Thank you, Yusuf, and thanks to the Jerusalem Fund for having me here. I will talk today about BDS, the global struggle for Palestinian rights, in light of the legacy of Dr. King and Nelson Mandela. And for those of you who can't see very well, there are a few seats up here, if you want to move. Martin Luther King famously said, "The deep rumbling of discontent that we hear today is the thunder of disinherited masses, rising from dungeons of oppression to the bright hills of freedom. In one majestic chorus, the rising masses singing, 'Ain't gonna let nobody turn us around.'" This is the moment that we feel we're at in the BDS movement, where we feel no one can turn us around. And Nelson Mandela said, "Our freedom is incomplete without the freedom of the Palestinians." In fact, South African civil society has been the largest supporter of the BDS campaign in the world. Just a very brief history for those who are not as familiar. The map on the extreme left is the map of Palestine during the British Mandate, the yellow map. To its right is the partition plan, with the yellow parts designated to the so-called Arab state and the white part to the so-called Jewish state. But in reality, Israel established itself on the third map on the entire white area, leaving the West Bank and Gaza, which it later occupied in 1967. And now we have patches of yellow, which is what's left for the Palestinians, interspersed by the white spots, which are Jewish-only colonial settlements. According to the latest census, the number of Palestinians today is 11.22 million. 50% of whom live outside historic Palestine. That's Israel, West Bank, and Gaza. 12% are Palestinian citizens of Israel, and 37 to 38% live in the occupied Palestinian territory. Why is this important? Because for those who say we support Palestinian rights and therefore we want to end the occupation, they're addressing the rights, some of the rights of the 38% only. They're ignoring the 62%. Why did I say some of the rights? Because the 38% in the occupied West Bank and Gaza, including East Jerusalem, 44% of them are refugees. So, put together, the number of refugees are 7.78 million out of the 11.2 million Palestinians. That's 69% of the Palestinian population today are refugees. Only 31% are not refugees. Of course, the refugee population includes the hundreds of thousands of internally displaced persons in Israel itself. Palestinian citizens of Israel who are ethnically cleansed are not allowed to go home because they're the wrong type. So the BDS call, when it came out on 9 July 2005, specifically mentioned the three basic rights of the three main communities of the Palestinian people: ending the 1967 occupation and colonization, including the wall and so on; ending the system of institutionalized, legalized racial discrimination, which qualifies as apartheid, and I'll get to that later. I'm not using the term in an inflammatory way. I'll explain exactly why this is an accurate description of Israel's regime within Israel's pre-67 borders. The third and foremost right is the right of return for refugees. As I said, 69% of the Palestinians would consider this their most important right. The BDS call came out on 9 July 2005 specifically because that was the first anniversary of the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, ruling against Israel's wall and colonies built on occupied territory as illegal. A year after, Palestinian civil society saw that the so-called international community under U.S. hegemony was unable or unwilling to deliver our rights, to even make Israel stop constructing its illegal wall, let alone ending the occupation, apartheid, or helping us achieve the right of return. The main issue to us is that moral right can and should prevail over military might. This is the main lesson we learned from the civil rights movement in this country and from the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa, among other struggles around the world. The BDS movement is a global movement, decentralized movement, rights-based movement that's led today by the BDS National Committee, which is the largest civil society coalition among Palestinians, the absolute largest. It includes representatives of all political parties, trade unions, women's unions, NGO networks, refugee advocacy groups, inside historic Palestine as well as outside. The main slogans of the BDS movement are freedom, justice, and equality. This is why we always say BDS is not a leftist agenda. Of course, we expect leftists to support it, but this is quite a liberal agenda. Any self-respecting liberal should be able to support freedom, justice, and equality anywhere in the world. So self-determination for the Palestinians, which is our inalienable right, constitutes ending all three forms of Israel's oppression: occupation, apartheid, and denial of refugee rights. The most important aspect is equality. According to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. Very simple, but often forgotten principle. So let's take the 1967 territory. Israel's occupation takes many forms and has many facets, from the colonization and settlement building around occupied East Jerusalem to the siege of Gaza and the war against Gaza, end of 2008-2009, which some international legal scholars like Richard Falk accused of constituting acts of genocide, to the prevalent racist expressions of Israeli settlers in the occupied territories, as this graffiti in Hebron, El Khalil, which says Arabs to the gas chambers. But in Gaza, this is where Israel crossed all hitherto red lines in its attacks on Palestinian civilians, using white phosphorus on a UN building. This is a UN school used as a shelter for mainly Palestinian women and children escaping the war, and it was bombed with white phosphorus. Amnesty International focused on another aspect of the occupation. In a report titled Thirsting for Justice, issued a couple of years ago, Amnesty accused Israel of denying water to the Palestinians as a means of expulsion. The West Bank was divided according to the Oslo agreements to Area A, B, and C. I won't bore you with the details, but briefly, Area C is the largest, the most fertile lands, and the water aquifers are placed in that area. Increasingly, Israel is denying water access in that area to expel the Palestinians from that area. One example is you cannot dig a well on your own land to collect rainwater, something Palestinian farmers have done for centuries. They rely completely on rainwater and collecting rainwater in the rain season to survive the rest of the year. Now they're not allowed. Israeli bulldozers would go in and destroy any cisterns, any wells you dig on your own land, because even on your land, you don't own rainwater that falls on it. And the prevalence of racism within Israeli society, which has become really scary in the last number of years. Israeli various army platoons compete who produces the most abrasive designs. In this particular case, they have a Palestinian woman, pregnant woman, with crosshairs on her belly, and it says "one shot, two kills" in English. And these are very popular T-shirts among Israeli soldiers. Another design has an Israeli soldier raping a young Palestinian girl, and underneath it says "no virgins, no terror attacks." And taking Palestinian children as human shields, as was well documented by Human Rights Watch, Amnesty, among others. And one particular case made it to the mainstream media, this 13-year-old boy whose arm was tied to the jeep so that his friends cannot throw stones on the occupation jeep. And the infamous wall that's reproducing the ghetto. But even if we move out of the occupied Palestinian territories of 1967 into Israel itself, increasingly scholars, pundits are recognizing Israel's system of discrimination against its Palestinian population as constituting apartheid, which is a universal crime. Some people might jump and say, oh, but Israel is so different than South Africa. We did not mention South Africa yet. It doesn't have to be identical to South Africa to qualify as apartheid. Apartheid is a universal crime, defined in the 1973 International Convention on the Punishment and Suppression of the Crime of Apartheid, and defined in the 2002 Rome Statute for the International Criminal Court. In both definitions, Israel's system of legalized discrimination conforms to the definition of apartheid. The Russell Tribunal on Palestine, which is a civil society tribunal, in its latest session in Cape Town, with jurists such as Alice Walker, some of the leaders of the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa, reached the conclusion that Israel's rule over the Palestinian people, wherever they reside, collectively amounts to a single integrated regime of apartheid. The key point is wherever they reside. They're no longer talking about the West Bank and Gaza. They're saying Israel's rule over the entire Palestinian people, including those in exile, those in Israel, as well as those in the occupied territories, amounts to apartheid. South African Christian leaders, in their response to a Palestinian Christian document that I'll refer to later called Kairos Palestine, in their response they had this very interesting statement. They said, from our own experience with apartheid, we can clearly and without equivocation say that the Palestinian situation is in essence the same as apartheid, and in its practical manifestation even worse than South African apartheid. The late Edward Said had it all, equality or nothing. Equal rights becomes the most important aspect in our rights-based struggle for Palestinian rights. One manifestation of Israeli apartheid is in land ownership. Through various mechanisms, mainly through a lot of power given to the Jewish National Fund in the Israel Land Administration bureaucracy, effectively 93% of the land of Israel is off limits to non-Jews. So Palestinian citizens of Israel, born there, like my wife, cannot buy land, cannot live, cannot rent on 93% of the area of Israel. In South Africa, in comparison, it was 86% off limits to blacks. Another aspect is churches, houses of prayers. As many of you know, during the Nakba of 1948, the systematic ethnic cleansing of the majority of Palestinians, many houses of prayers were destroyed by Israel. Churches, mosques, especially mosques. This one church was not destroyed, but it was turned into a cattle shed. This is in Ma'lul, a village in the north of Israel today. It's a Roman Catholic church. It was kept as a cattle shed used by Israeli farmers until 2005. This mosque in Ein Hod near Haifa was even less fortunate. It was turned into an Israeli bar restaurant, but the entire village of Ein Hod was ethnically cleansed, was not destroyed, and was turned into an Israeli Jewish artists' colony, with its residents mostly living not too far away, waking up every day watching their beautiful houses and orchards occupied by strangers. And Al-Araqib, a village in the Naqab, the Negev desert in the south of Israel. It's a Bedouin village that was destroyed literally dozens of times, and every time the residents rebuild it with a lot of help of international solidarity activists, Israeli progressive activists, and so on. And every time the bulldozers go back in and destroy it, because it's an, quote, unrecognized village. Another aspect of the Nakba, the 1948 ethnic cleansing, that many people do not know of, and now we know in detail, is Israel's destruction of tens of thousands of Palestinian books that it stole from private homes, from libraries, from public spaces, and destroyed systematically. So we talked about occupation, we talked about apartheid. The third most important aspect of the BDS call is the call for the right of return for Palestinian refugees. Why should this concern the general American public? You have enough of your own problems with deteriorating infrastructure, health, education, you name it. You have enough problems in this country, unemployment and so on, poverty rate rising. Well, according to a Brown University recent study, the US spent $4 trillion in the last 10 years on its wars in Pakistan, Iraq, and Afghanistan, decimating Iraq, decimating Afghanistan, and causing hundreds of thousands of deaths, including thousands of American servicemen and women who lost their lives in that war. And we all know what the money did in Afghanistan and elsewhere. In general, the idea is that we in the global south are perceived as lesser humans, or what I call relative humans. Humans only in the relative sense, like blacks were in the southern states in this country, like blacks were in South Africa, like the Dalits in India, and so on. It's viewing the other as a lesser human, so you can do a lot of things against him or her because they're not really fully human. So they're not entitled to the full set of human rights. And racism abroad feeds into and nourishes racism at home. Where's the Israeli connection to all this? According to Mearsheimer and Walt, Israel's lobby, particularly the neoconservatives, were a critical factor behind the US war on Iraq. But it would be inaccurate to claim that the US went to war only because of Israeli interests, because Israel does serve a lot of corporate interests in this country. All the military manufacturers and the homeland security and the oil companies and the banks all benefit from Israel's wars and from continuous wars elsewhere. So yes, Israel was pushing for the war against Iraq, but it wasn't alone. There's the 1% in this country that itches for wars every once in a while to sell hardware and to test its products and so on, definitely was in harmony with Israel on going to war, and they're doing it again. We're seeing Iraq 2.0 with Iran now, fabricating evidence of nuclear weapons that don't exist, and so on and so forth. But in particular about the Iraq war, Philip Zelikow, the executive director of the 9/11 Commission, said the real threat from Iraq was not a threat to the US. The unstated threat was the threat against Israel. So certainly the Israel factor was an important factor, not the only one, but certainly a very important factor. Despite that, the US in 2009 decided to give Israel $30 billion in military aid between 2009 and 2018. This is extra military aid to what they get regularly. And as the US campaign to end the Israeli occupation research shows, if you break it down into states, I had a lot of presentations in Atlanta, so I presented the Georgia share of this funding, and it comes out to $755 million. Georgia, the state of Georgia alone, would fund Israel extra military aid to Israel to the tune of $755 million, instead of building 9,175 affordable housing units for Georgia alone, or instead of providing 12,500 sustainable green jobs, or instead of providing 612,000 primary health care for the uninsured. But why is that? As Desmond Tutu says, because Israel is placed on a pedestal in this country. And to criticize it is to be immediately dubbed anti-Semitic, as if the Palestinians were not Semitic, he says. People are scared in this country to say wrong is wrong, Desmond Tutu says. So they stay silent. But silence is complicity. Why is that? Because your tax money is what's funding our oppression. Our oppression has "Made in the USA" written all over it. So silence, apathy is not an option. Again, as Desmond Tutu says, if you're neutral in a situation of oppression, you've sided with the oppressor, particularly if your money is what's doing the oppression. But some people might say, okay, this is fine, but we don't want to go the boycott path. We want peace. We want to pursue peace. Well, peace to the oppressed is absolutely meaningless if not associated with justice. Because without justice, it amounts to institutionalizing injustice. And no oppressed community is interested in that. So we don't want peace. We want a just peace. There's a huge difference. We want our basic rights. And you can't sugarcoat oppression and expect a nice master will make us be more content slaves. It doesn't work like that. We want to end oppression completely. We don't want to sugarcoat it or make it look nicer. As Desmond Tutu says, we do not want our chains comfortable. We want them removed. So the BDS movement is very much inspired by the legacy of Mandela, King, and Gandhi's nonviolent resistance. But it's deeply rooted in the Palestinian heritage of peaceful civil resistance, which is often not mentioned in this country. For 100 years, facing settler colonialism, occupation, and apartheid, Palestinians have predominantly resisted through nonviolent, peaceful means. That took many, many forms. From mass demonstrations in Jaffa as far back as 1933 against the British Mandate and the onslaught of settler colonialism, to literary, artistic, musical resistance, cultural resistance, which Palestinians are very proud of, to this demonstration by academics and students of Birzeit University in the first Intifada, the popular uprising of 1987. Some of you might recognize some faces there, Gabi Baramki, Hanan Ashrawi, and others. What they were protesting against specifically is the closure of universities. After the breakout of the Intifada in 1987, Israel shut down all Palestinian universities. Soon after, they shut down all Palestinian schools, and then they shut down all Palestinian kindergartens. So Palestinian education became criminalized and went underground. A student carrying a textbook was arrested and her book confiscated because she was violating the law. YMCA classes, clandestine classes, were raided and everyone arrested because they were having an illegal class. And of course, Beit Sahur with its famous tax revolt, and they raised the same slogan, no taxation without representation, during the first Intifada, refusing to pay taxes to the occupation authorities. Even middle-class women who matched their scarves with their shoes participated. So education became a form of resistance. Those girls in El Khalil, Hebron, were just trying to go to school, prevented at gunpoint during a curfew, one of the many curfews struck in El Khalil. And this Palestinian resistance, mostly civil popular resistance, was a prelude to the Arab Spring and largely inspired the Arab Spring, as we hear often from leaders of the Egyptian, Tunisian, and other Arab revolutions, which in turn inspired the Occupy movement in this country. So when Occupy Wall Street spread across this nation, everyone around the world was extremely excited. It's not a small deal that the US 99% is finally awakening. I wouldn't say awake yet, but awakening, which is a great step in the right direction. So we raised the slogan, Occupy Wall Street, not Palestine, making the connection that our struggle is part of the 99% struggle for global freedom, justice, and dignity, and against the perpetual war Inc. that benefits from ongoing wars. But what about parity? We want to be neutral there. We don't want to take sides. We want both sides. Nelson Mandela had a very good statement about this. He said, we can easily be enticed to read reconciliation and fairness as meaning parity between justice and injustice. And this is not only false, this is unethical. So some might say, you know, I'm against the occupation, but I'm not against Israel. Let's see what that would mean in the American slavery era. Imagine in the 1800s or 1900s somebody saying, I support the US, but I'm against slavery. This minor issue of slavery I'm against. But otherwise, the US is a fine country. Or in South Africa saying, you know, I love South Africa, but I detest apartheid. This, again, minor problem with South Africa. It would be ludicrous, but in the Israeli case, it's normalized. It's people look at it as normal because you're bombarded with it in the mainstream media. I'm only against the occupation. Otherwise, I support Israel. Well, guess what? Israel is the state that's doing the occupation. In international law, we deal with the occupying power, which is Israel, the state that's performing this. So when the UN takes measures against the occupying power, it's against Israel. It's not the occupation. There's no state in the UN called the occupation that we can boycott. A major part of BDS is the economic boycott. And I'm raising this because many people might say, okay, this is morally sound, it sounds great, but can you have an impact? Israel is such a strong economy, which is true. It's such a powerful country, the fifth most powerful army in the world, with a massive nuclear weapons arsenal. That's true. Can you ever dream of having an economic impact on Israel? Well, first, this movement is too young to judge. We're less than 7 years old. BDS was launched in 2005. And for those with short memory that always tell me, oh, but in South Africa, I mean, everyone was against apartheid, the churches and the unions and everyone. Those people have very short memory. They're talking about the second part of the 1980s. Where I went to school at Columbia University, I remember how slow the process was. It was completely unfashionable earlier, and then only towards the second half of the 1980s it became fashionable, where no one suddenly ever supported apartheid. Everyone was always anti-apartheid, born against apartheid. It became the fashion. But it took our South African comrades more than 30 years to reach the mainstream in the West. They started their boycott in the 1950s. So let's not forget that. In comparison, as Tutu and others, leaders of the anti-apartheid movement, tell us, we're going much, much faster. Some examples of this economic impact. We targeted two specific companies, Veolia and Alstom, French companies involved in the Jerusalem Light Rail, which is a rail project connecting the illegal colonies around and in Jerusalem with the city of Jerusalem. So 100% illegal. Since we started targeting them in November 2008, Veolia lost contracts worth $12 billion, in fact more than that, mainly in the UK, Ireland, Scandinavia, and elsewhere. So complicity is carrying a heavier price nowadays. Alstom, just very recently, in the end of last year, lost a massive contract in Saudi Arabia worth $9.4 billion. And of course, Alstom came out and said, oh, it was a financial issue. It had nothing to do with politics or the Jerusalem Light Rail or Israel or anything. Until the Saudi embassy in Cairo issued an official statement saying, we excluded Alstom because of its role in colonizing Jerusalem. So we rest our case. Norway, which has the third largest sovereign pension fund in the world, we lobbied the Norwegian pension fund, Adala New York, which is a BDS group here, Stop the Wall in Palestine, representing the BDS National Committee, and Who Profits, which is a project of the Israeli Coalition of Women for Peace, one of our partners in Israel. We have several partners in Israel supporting BDS. The Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions, the Alternative Information Center, the Coalition of Women for Peace, Boycott from Within, and so on. Together, we lobbied the Norwegian Pension Fund to divest from two Israeli companies, Elbit Systems and Africa Israel, that are implicated in Israel's violations of human rights in the occupied territories, and we succeeded. Agrexco, which was, now we can use the past tense, the largest Israeli company exporting produce in the world for decades. It was an iconic company in Israel, went bankrupt, and we have reason to believe this was largely due to BDS campaigns in France, Spain, Britain, Ireland, Scandinavia, and elsewhere. Especially in France, they established a coalition against Agrexco with 5 national parties and about 95 NGOs. No envy there. I know 5 national parties to you would sound like a dream, but in the trade union movement, from CUSATU in South Africa, the most solid supporter, to the Irish, to the Scottish, to the Brazilian CUT, which has 22 million members, the British Trade Union Congress, which has 6.5 million members, and in France and in Italy and in Canada, trade unions of very heavyweights started joining the BDS movement. And when Israel committed its bloodbath on the Freedom Flotilla, which was carrying humanitarian aid to Gaza on May 30th, 2010, everyone got so angry, and the BDS National Committee and Palestinian civil society asked our supporters, don't get angry, do something, hold Israel accountable. Specifically, we called on dock workers to stop offloading and loading Israeli ships as a response. And we issued it, expecting some symbolic response, but the response was anything but symbolic. The Swedish Dock Workers Union, in fact, did stop offloading Israeli ships for about 8 days in Cochin, India, the fourth largest port in India, in South Africa, in Turkey, in Greece, and even in Oakland, California. Dock workers, with a lot of support from the community, stopped offloading a Zim Israeli ship for 24 hours. A short period, but a historic 24 hours. So BDS has finally crossed the Atlantic, with the US campaign to end the Israeli occupation playing the key role, the leading role in BDS campaigns around the country. But there's a lot of creativity in the BDS world. From the Code Pink campaign against Ahava, the Dead Sea minerals cosmetics company that uses minerals from the occupied territories, which usually demonstrates in pink bikinis. This time it's black, I don't know why. But Ahava in Hebrew means love, and their slogan is no Ahava with occupation, no love with occupation. And they attract a lot of media attention with their very innovative methods. And Adala, New York, with their subversive Christmas carols calling for BDS. So context sensitivity and sustainability are the main principles, practical principles for the movement. This is not a centralized movement where some command decides what needs to be done. Activists on the ground in every place decide what's best to target and how to go about it. Israeli Apartheid Week is an excellent example of that, which started in Toronto in 2005, and this year, which is happening now, it's being held at 120 colleges across the world, in more than 40 cities across the world. But some people might say, is this significant? I mean, does it really affect Israel? Well, Israel thinks so. This year, I don't know if you've read, the Israeli Foreign Ministry hired 100 emissaries. 100 Israelis are touring the world to combat Israeli Apartheid Week. They did not do this against Iran. They did not hire 100 Israelis to go around the world arguing the case, doing a PR propaganda stunt against Iran. But against Israeli Apartheid Week, they've done that. Imagine 100 employees going around the world. And of course, the Olympia Food Co-op was the first supermarket in this country to boycott Israeli goods completely. And Olympia, of course, is the hometown of Rachel Corrie, the great American rights activist who died defending a Palestinian home in Rafah from demolition, which was who was killed, and the house was demolished ultimately by a Caterpillar bulldozer driven by an Israeli soldier. To flash mobs, and this is the greatest, I think, the one in Grand Central Station in New York City. And we get to the serious business of churches. Churches must be the most important institution in this country, the largest at least. Despite their diversity, they're extremely important. And increasingly in the BDS movement, we're working with churches to push forward divestment resolutions. The United Methodist Church is having its General Assembly coming up in April, early May, and the Presbyterians in July. In both cases, they have divestment motions, which are extremely important. If either divestment motion passes, and they're calling for divestment from American companies that are profiting from the occupation. So very clear cut, no difficulty there. If either motion passes, it will be a game changer for BDS in the US, a real game changer. We will have crossed the threshold from going from the margins to the real mainstream in the US. Until 2009, there was no unified Palestinian Christian voice calling for BDS. As some of you might know, our Christian denominations hardly agree on anything. Christmas, Easter, they don't agree on anything. But on this one issue, they all agree. Representatives of the entire spectrum of Christian denominations agreed on the Kairos Palestine document, which is a theological document based on Christian theology that sees an obligation to resist injustice. And BDS is one of the measures that were recommended to resist injustice. But they see it as an obligation, not a nicety, not something you do in your spare time. It's an obligation. That changed the discourse among many mainstream churches around the world. In Europe, certainly, and increasingly in the US. There's still a lot of raising awareness to be done about the Kairos Palestine document and how it calls for BDS. Last Christmas, the Kairos Palestine group issued the Bethlehem Call of 2011, which specifically and explicitly called for occupation no more, disbanding Israeli apartheid, and demanding the right of return for refugees. So they adopted the three basic rights in the BDS Call explicitly. And for those who don't read Arabic, the cartoon by Najil Ali says Intifada in the West Bank and Gaza, and here's Jesus kicking the occupation in the butt. What about Jewish groups? We've always heard, oh, this cannot work in the US with all this Jewish support for Israel, all Jews support Israel, and so on. This was never accurate, and it's certainly not accurate now. Israel never spoke on behalf of the entire Jewish community in the US or anywhere in the world. Increasingly, especially after Gaza, 2008-2009, we're seeing Jewish groups getting off the fence and endorsing BDS, or at least BDS campaigns. The Jewish Voice for Peace must be the most important example of that. With a mailing list of 110,000 members, it's a huge, significant organization. Jewish Voice for Peace led a campaign against TIA-CREF to pressure this large pension fund to divest from 5 companies profiting from the occupation. French, American, and Israeli companies profiting from the occupation. And there's a big coalition that's working on this. The US campaign is facilitating a lot of that work. But also International Jewish Anti-Zionist Network is leading a campaign against the Jewish National Fund, exposing it as a racist and colonial entity that should not get charity status in any country. And American Jews for a Just Peace, and I can go on. Increasingly, they're saying, not in our name. Israel does not speak on our behalf and cannot represent us. Pinkwashing, which was one of the important tactics used by Israel since the BDS movement was established, increasingly Israel is using its relatively relaxed acceptance of gay rights compared to Arab countries in the neighborhood to say that, why are you boycotting us? We're gay friendly. South Africa was much more gay friendly than the rest of the African countries, but was that an excuse to maintain a system of apartheid? In Israel, they seem to think, yes, we should be exempt from boycott just because we're gay friendly. Of course, many in the queer movement, many leaders like Sarah Schulman, who got this op-ed in the New York Times, started exposing this pinkwashing tactic. Another important aspect, and I'm reaching the end here, is the academic and cultural boycott of Israel. Unlike the South African campaign for academic and cultural boycott, the Palestinian campaign does not target individuals. It's not a blanket boycott. In South Africa, it was. We target institutions only, which means that any Israeli academic artist who's coming independently to teach, to tour, to exhibit, so long as there's no foreign ministry money, Israeli foreign ministry money funding him or her, there's nothing against them. We're targeting institutions due to their grave and long, prolonged complicity in Israel's violations of human rights. Our main partner in the US in the academic and cultural boycott is the US ACB, the US Campaign for the Academic and Cultural Boycott of Israel, which has hundreds of academics and artists supporting it. One of the early results was Hampshire College divesting from Israel. With a lot of work from students at Hampshire, they divested in 2009 from 6 companies that are profiting from Israeli occupation. And Berkeley voted, the student council voted to divest from Israel, and we had a huge majority, but not the 2/3 majority needed to override a veto by the president of the student council. Very undemocratically, he vetoed the resolution and it did not pass. And students at UPenn just organized the first national BDS conference at the University of Pennsylvania. And as many of you might know, it was severely attacked in the mainstream media, bringing a lot of awareness. You know, the lobby shoots itself in the foot quite often. And now we have the support, we're very proud of the support of major cultural figures, literary figures in this country and around the world. From Alice Walker, who famously said that Rosa Parks would support BDS to soothe the pain and attend the sorrows of a people wrongly treated for generations. To Angela Davis, who said it's not the image of the Israeli government that needs changing, but rather its racist and repressive policies and practices of apartheid. To Naomi Klein, who took a very pragmatic angle and said boycott is not a dogma, it's a tactic. The reason the strategy should be tried is practical. In a country so small and trade dependent as Israel, it could actually work. And Roger Waters of Pink Floyd, I'm against Israel, he says, for exactly the same reasons that I was against South Africa. It's a 2-tiered racist system. I'm calling on my fellow musicians and artists to join the BDS campaign against Israel. Enough is enough. And Stefan Hessel, a living legend, a Jewish Holocaust survivor who's the co-author of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, who said BDS campaigns around the world present the most promising way to overcome the failure of world governments to stand up to Israel's intransigence and lawless behavior. And finally, Judith Butler, who said BDS is the only way that citizens can call for the enforcement of international law. Cultural boycott really spread in the last 2 years, with many artists refusing to play Israel and Tel Aviv looking increasingly like Sun City. From Gil Scott-Heron to Elvis Costello to the Pixies, Ken Loach, Vanessa Paradis, to even Snoop Dogg, and many, many, many more heeded our call not to play Israel. And when one South African company violated the boycott, Archbishop Tutu said, just as we said during apartheid that it was inappropriate for international artists to perform in South Africa in a society founded on discriminatory laws and racial exclusivity, so it would be wrong for Cape Town Opera to perform in Israel. Finally, the Israeli establishment is increasingly looking at BDS, describing it as, quote, a strategic threat. An exaggeration, no doubt, but it indicates the impact. For those skeptics who are still saying, okay, we don't believe it will ever have an impact, clearly the Israeli establishment feels it will, and it is having an impact. At a very basic level, what we're asking people to do, especially in this country, to do no harm. By doing nothing, you're doing harm, because your tax money is funding our oppression. We're asking you to withdraw your support for evil, as Martin Luther King has it. That's a very profound moral obligation. It's not heroic. We're not asking you to come down to the garrisons, as it were, and fight against the wall in Bil'in and so on. At the very basic level, no, just withdraw your support for evil, at a very basic level. And as Martin Luther King said, change does not roll in on the wheels of inevitability, but comes through continuous struggle. And so we must straighten our backs and work for our freedom. A man can't ride you unless your back is bent. And in the BDS movement, our back is anything but bent. We're walking with straight backs towards freedom, justice, and equality. This is what Mandela and King would have done. Thank you.
Omar, thank you very much. We're going to take some questions, and just let me announce again for those watching online, I know we got a number of people following online and sending tweets through. This would be the time to send your questions or comments in via Twitter, again, at Palestine Center. And why don't we start right here? Just wait a moment for the microphone so that we can hear you on the live stream as well.
Omar, you titled your talk referencing Martin Luther King and Nelson Mandela. So these are two movements where the church, as you mentioned, played a very, very important role, certainly in the beginning with the civil rights movement and sort of to tip the scales at the very end with apartheid. With the increased activism of the American church here, I think, and we talked about this before, we can expect enormous, well-organized, very, very well-funded pressure from Israel, from the Israel lobby here, from Jewish interests and Christian Zionist interests here to come down very hard. So I'm wondering, what is your, two quick questions. What is your advice, just strategically as well as tactically, about how we can work with that here, and how can the churches be in coalition and in productive alliance with the other sort of secular and grassroots movements that are growing up?
Okay, thanks for the question. Indeed, this is a very strategic aspect of the work in this country, the struggle for Palestinian rights. We certainly have to do a lot of focus on the churches. And you're right, the backlash is already happening. It's immense backlash, and it will happen it will increase even more as we get closer to the United Methodist and the Presbyterian conferences. I think it's very important just to emphasize that this is a struggle for basic rights. They try to distract and to change the agenda and discuss anti-Semitism. And I want to address this specific issue because it's at the core of the attacks, that the Presbyterians are being anti-Semitic by calling for divesting from American companies profiting from the occupation, that they're anti-Semitic. Anyone who says, even boycotting Israel, forget divesting from American companies, even if the Presbyterian Church tomorrow called for boycotting Israel, anyone who says that is anti-Semitic is an anti-Semite. Because they're saying that Israel and the entire Jewish world are one and the same, and all of the Jews in the world are a monolithic sum that Israel represents and speaks on behalf. And as I've said before, and I'll keep repeating it, anyone who says all Jews are is an anti-Semite, regardless what comes after that. So I think the church needs some courage, really. I mean, the lobby works only because they intimidate, and the intimidation works. Once they stand up, they can really do what they feel is just. They can really implement their policies. Another important issue is to have more Palestinian Christian voices. Palestinians are missing in this debate. Until a couple of years ago, if a liberal group wanted to hear a Palestinian voice, they would invite somebody like Jeff Halper, who's a friend, a human rights activist, but he's Israeli. He doesn't speak on behalf of the Palestinians. Palestinian voices are missing. And many in this country forget that there are Palestinian Christians. Palestinians are put in this one basket, all Muslim, no Christians. And it's very important increasingly to hear Palestinian Christian voices. So Kairos Palestine, I think, needs to be distributed during Sunday prayers in every small church. So anyone involved in churches, if we can do that, distribute the Kairos Palestine document and have a discussion after prayer. What would this mean? What are Palestinian Christians calling on us to do in this country? It would change the discourse a lot, I think.
Let's go across the room here. The young lady in the front in white. Just wait for the microphone. We'll work our way back across the room as well.
Hi. I want to ask you something about balancing the short term and the long term. And by bringing that, I want to kind of take it back to the 50% in exile that you're talking about. I was taking notes of some of the things that you said, and to me, a lot of them ring back to what some of the Arab governments are doing to their own Israeli population. Legal discrimination in Lebanon.
Israeli population?
Sorry, Palestinian population.
Okay.
Legal discrimination in Lebanon against the Palestinians is over, and you can see it in all their decrees and all their laws. Lack of access to building material, no fresh water, no education. The list can go on and on about things that have been going on there. And beyond just relief work, what can we do in the short term to ensure that long-term goals of ensuring the right to return and all these things don't really obscure getting rights to these refugees who really need them now?
Thanks for the question, but I wouldn't accept the comparison. There's a huge difference between a country that ethnically cleansed an indigenous population and a host country that's mistreating them.
What about Sabra and Shatila?
Yes, but that was an Israeli orchestrated massacre done through Lebanese hands. But let me finish. My point is, I'm not belittling the denial of basic rights to the Palestinian refugees, especially in Lebanon, more than any other place. In Syria and Jordan, they're much better off. In Lebanon is where the real discrimination is. And this has to absolutely be revealed and exposed and fought. Because until refugees return, they deserve their basic human rights, obviously. And we need to expose that. But I wouldn't look at it as symmetric to Israel's denial, because that's a much more fundamental denial of the rights of refugees to return home. So we have to continue raising the issue that Palestinian refugees have to go home. Now, if they choose to go home or not, it's up to them. But it's an inalienable right, it's a basic human right, and nothing can trump that. So yes, we can do, it's not either or. We can still call for the right of return and expose denial of Palestinian refugees' rights in Iraq, for example, and in Lebanon. So I agree to an extent.
We'll take another question in a second. I just want to ask you one that comes into us via Twitter. A user asks if you could respond to the controversy in the International Palestinian Solidarity Movement, this is their language, around Norman Finkelstein's calling BDS a cult run by gurus.
Because of Norman Finkelstein's history in support of Palestinian rights, I'd rather not comment on this.
Okay. In the back, and then we'll come up here. Oh, okay. Let's come up here. I know you've been waiting patiently, sir. And
well, just revisit. I won't ask specifically about Finkelstein, but one of the things he says in his interview, I think you should address this, is that people in the BDS movement don't address head-on the question of one state, two state. And I was wondering if you could, because I was at the BDS conference, and there's a strong one-state settlement. And And a lot of us who are activists have moved into the one-state camp because of the facts on the ground there.
Very good question. In the BDS movement, we take absolutely no position on one state versus two states. This is a very conscious decision. As a rights-based movement, what we're telling our supporters elsewhere, don't decide for us. Self-determination means we get to decide our future. So don't decide on behalf of the Palestinians. This is not the most important item on the agenda of solidarity movements. The main point is supporting Palestinian rights, regardless if it's a one-state, two-state, or five-state solution. Now, why did we choose not to take a position on this? Because our basic three rights, ending occupation, ending apartheid, and the right of return, should be respected in any solution. But doesn't that de facto exclude a two-state solution? Why? Assuming we have a two-state solution based on international law, not dictated by the Israeli and US governments, assuming it's based on international law, that does not extinguish the right of refugees to go home. Neither does it exonerate Israel from the need to comply with international law vis-a-vis its own non-Jewish citizens. So Israel cannot get away with its apartheid. It cannot get away with its denial of refugee rights in a one-state or a two-state solution. It's irrelevant what political solution you have. You still have to uphold those basic rights. For some who say, but equality in Israel, it's too far-fetched and it's not agreed upon. Equality is the most fundamental right in international law. The very first item in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It's the foundation of international law. The issue of equal rights to all humans is the foundation of the law. This is definitely far more grounded in international law than ending the occupation, by the way. Because the occupation per se is not illegal. It's what Israel is doing to maintain its occupation. The colonies, the siege, the killings, the uprooting of trees, house demolitions, that's illegal. Those are war crimes, yes. The occupation per se is not illegal. So if we talk about international law, our claim to equality is certainly much, much stronger than the claim to ending the occupation. Our claim to the right of return is certainly much more rooted in international law than ending the occupation. So why pick one and ignore the others? It's ending the occupation, equality for Palestinians in Israel, and the right of return, regardless what the solution is. This is our position.
Follow-up question. Taking yourself out of the BDS movement, what is your position on one state, two state?
Oh, it's no secret. For 30 years, I've advocated a one-state solution. I've written it in several languages. It's all over the place. But that's my personal position. Palestinians disagree. The majority in the BDS movement, actually, the National Committee, the BNC, which is leading the global BDS movement, the great majority is a two-state majority. Unfortunately for me, but that's the reality. The great majority of the members of the BDS National Committee are two-staters until now. So it's false to say that BDS is a one-state agenda. Absolutely false. Absolutely.
I want to press you a little bit on one thing that was said, if you don't want to respond directly to Finkelstein, but to the idea that was mentioned that the majority of people internationally agree on some sort of outcome, therefore you should explicitly work for that. Mm-hmm. In other words, people accept Israel without a right of return, therefore you should work for that. What do you have to say to that from a strategic point of view?
I think if somebody makes this point, I would disagree with the premise. When somebody says people agree, are they talking about some people in New York, for example? Certainly they're not talking about people around the world. Certainly not Brazilians and South Africans and Indians and Chinese. They're talking about a small part of the world population and claiming these are the world. We are the world. No, you're not. You're not the world. Believe it or not. I have news for you. You're not the world. So the premise is wrong. But assuming the premise is right, if we went with the herd, and the herd supports eliminating basic rights for certain people, we would have never had a civil rights movement succeed in this country because the people did not see blacks as fit to have equal rights in Alabama and so on. So if we went along with that, we would have never had equal rights for blacks in this country. We would have never had a successful civil rights movement. And the people in the 1960s wanted to go along with South African apartheid. They did not see it as a major problem. Okay, they might have disagreed with the explicit racism, but they did not want to oppose it. So the people, we would have gone with the people, and we would never have ended apartheid in South Africa. The point is what's right, And the people's points change, even in this country, which is not the world, I remind you. People's opinions change. 10 years ago, whoever would have mentioned divestment from Israel? I mean, it was impossible to dream of. Some very vanguard groups, maybe the US campaign to end Israeli occupation, some Berkeley students, some, put that on the agenda. But it certainly was not in the mainstream. Now it's discussed in the New York Times and on CNN and so on. So people's opinions change. What's most important is to stick to what's right. What are the basic human rights? And we should always uphold that and never lose sight of that. Despite the odds, despite the power of the oppressor, we can prevail.
Okay. Let's go right here in the back, and then we'll come across.
This is a question from the US ACPI Twitter. Can you speak on what signals you see from Israel to the effectiveness of BDS? So what kind of repressive tactics is Israel engaging in that are a signal that BDS is working?
Okay, there are many indicators of how alarmed Israel is. First, in July of last year, Israel passed an anti-boycott law, which targets Israelis who support any form of boycott against Israel or any of its institutions. Now, for those who say, boycott from within, all these Israeli groups, predominantly Jewish groups in Israel supporting BDS, are so small and insignificant. Well, they're small, they're growing, but they're not insignificant. Otherwise, Israel wouldn't have gone through this measure of passing such a draconian law that drops the very last mask of democracy, an extremely draconian law, very much freedom of expression, that says people cannot advocate a boycott. Writing an article becomes illegal. It's a tort, and you can be held accountable. So clearly Israel sees boycott as very threatening. And as I said, they're using the term strategic threat. That's another indicator. But I'll give you a couple of anecdotes. Benjamin Ben Eliezer, a leading Labour Party figure in Israel, was addressing Netanyahu, saying, as a former industry and trade minister, I tell you, the markets are closing. We will suffer a devastating economic blow. Shimon Peres, in my view, the smartest Zionist alive, voiced fear that Israel might be subjected to economic boycotts and sanctions, and said there's no need for boycotts, he said. It would suffice for ports in Europe and Canada to stop unloading Israeli merchandise. It's already beginning. He's referring to what we did with dock workers around the world. As small as it was, Paris is extremely alarmed by it. And finally, Ehud Barak, the most decorated general in Israel's history, said there are elements in the world quite powerful in various countries, including friendly ones, in trade unions, among academics, consumers, green political parties. And this impetus has culminated in a broad movement called BDS, which is what was done with South Africa. So clearly, they're seeing BDS as being very effective. Despite its nuclear arsenal and massive army, Israel is not designed to combat nonviolent resistance movements. They don't know what to do with us. And as I jokingly said, if the Presbyterians pass a divestment resolution, what, are they going to bomb the Presbyterian Church? I mean, Israel knows how to bomb anything. They can bomb any Arab army out of existence. But what do you do with people's hearts and minds? You can't bomb them.
I want to take another question that comes in from Twitter. Does the BDS movement work in countries like Jordan and Qatar, for example, to stop further normalization?
First, I have to explain what normalization is, because not everyone understands this. This is a term used by Arabs in general. Normalization is, in a nutshell, making something abnormal appear as if it were normal. So a relationship between an oppressor and oppressed, which is abnormal, putting some cosmetics on it to make it look normal. That's what normalization means. In Jordan, in Qatar, in Egypt, especially under Mubarak, there was a lot of normalization, and in the occupied territories as well. There's a lot of Palestinian-Israeli normalization. Women-to-women group, youth and youth groups, all kinds of seeds of peace, all kinds of groups that do a lot of... they assume that this conflict is due to some ingrained hatred, some deep hatred, and all we need to do is to communicate and express our fears and share our feelings and meditate and so on, and it will go away. Well, a battered wife wouldn't like to share her feelings with her battering husband. They would need something else and some intervention of law enforcement, and this is far worse than battering a wife, far worse than domestic violence. So what they're trying to do is ignoring the root cause of this conflict, which is a colonial apartheid reality. So going back to the question, yes, BDS is active increasingly. Thanks to the Arab Spring, it has really spread from Morocco to Qatar, to Kuwait, to Jordan, to Egypt, to Tunisia. So now we have, to Lebanon, of course. Lebanon was always active in the BDS movement. So now we have an active BDS campaign in many Arab countries, which we couldn't claim 2 years ago.
I'm going to go in the back in the blue shirt here. If you just wait for the microphone for 1 second. And this is unfortunately going to be our last question because we are just over time. So please go ahead.
Piggybacking off what you said earlier about how Israel knows how to bomb everything and anything, I was rereading an article that you wrote in this 2009 issue of El Adab, and you seem very reverent of the past armed struggle against the Zionist regime. And I was just wondering how now in the present, if you feel there's any role for armed struggle and how that works or not in tandem with other, with popular resistance.
Okay, thank you. Now that's my personal view, not the BDS movement's view. My personal view, I never saw armed resistance in the Palestinian case as the most effective. We have a right to resist by all means, certainly under international law, so long as we don't indiscriminately attack the others. We have a right to resist against the occupation and the tools of occupation, the settlements and so on, but not unarmed civilians, non-combatants. We don't have that right, morally or under international law. So we have to stick to that even in any armed resistance Palestinians do. And this is a universal principle that I will always uphold. But other than the morality and the legality, I'm talking about politically speaking, I never saw, especially in the last 20 years, Palestinian armed resistance as particularly effective. Because you are facing an extremely powerful army, and we are under siege in the Palestinian occupied territories. There is no way to develop any armed resistance capability to speak of to combat the fifth strongest army in the world. It's literally impossible. We're not Lebanon, we're not Syria, we're not Egypt. We're under occupation, completely controlled and besieged by our occupier. So it's not very effective. Now, this doesn't mean that BDS is an alternative to, because that's not necessarily the view of the majority in the BDS movement. We are a non-violent, peaceful resistance movement. Absolutely. It's as non-violent as it gets, actually, no physical contact whatsoever. But it's not an alternative to anything. But it's one strategy of resistance that the absolute majority of Palestinian civil society everywhere accepts and adopts, regardless of their other views. So even national Islamic parties, they all adopt the BDS strategy. So we don't have any natural enemies, as it were. Some are under the table, but publicly, the great majority support that. And I think this is a much more effective form of resistance because it forces Israel into a battlefield, if you will, where we have the upper hand, the moral upper hand, where, as I said, they can't bomb us into submission.
Omar, thank you very much for the presentation today. For those of you who are interested in taking a look at the book and purchasing it, we have some of them. The book BDS by Omar Barghouti is available here, and I know Omar would be happy to sign them for those who are interested as well. And those who are joining us online, we thank you very much for tuning in and your questions as well. So thank you.